Λοιπόν, κυρίες και κύριοι, όπως βλέπετε κρατάμε το setup, αλλά αλλάζουμε τελείως θέμα και περιβάλλον. Στην πραγματικότητα επιστρέφουμε σε αυτό που ήταν το κεντρικό ερώτημα από χτες και παραμένει. Ένα ερώτημα που διατρέχει τις συζητήσεις, η προσπάθεια να καταλάβουμε τι ακριβώς αλλάζει στην αμερικανική εξωτερική πολιτική, στις αμερικανικές προτεραιότητες, πώς έχει αλλάξει ο τρόπος που η Αμερική βλέπει τον κόσμο και πώς αυτό μας επηρεάζει. Πώς αυτό επηρεάζει την Ελλάδα. Έχουμε λοιπόν τη δυνατότητα να ακούσουμε τη συμβολή ενός ανθρώπου που από πολλές απόψεις είναι ένας insider, είναι ένας κορυφαίος ειδικός σε θέματα εξωτερικής και αμυντικής πολιτικής στις ΗΠΑ. Υπήρξε πρέσβης των Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών στο ΝΑΤΟ πριν κάποια χρόνια και στην προηγούμενη θητεία του Πρόεδρου Τραμπ ήταν ο ειδικός απεσταλμένος των Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών για την Ουκρανία. Οπότε καταλαβαίνετε ότι μιλάμε με έναν άνθρωπο ο οποίος μπορεί να προσθέσει έγκυρα μια οπτική γωνία ή να βοηθήσει, εν πάση περιπτώσει, να καθαρίσει το δικό μας βλέμμα πάνω στα πράγματα που προσπαθούμε να παρακολουθήσουμε. Λοιπόν, ο καλεσμένος μας είναι ο πρέσβης Kurt Volker. Ambassador Volker, thank you very much for joining our conference. Thank you indeed.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Well, we are expecting a call tomorrow between Presidents Trump and Putin about Ukraine. Do you expect that we're going to have to see a direct outcome, the ceasefire agreed or no?
I don't think so. I don't think Putin is interested in a ceasefire at all. He's trying to pretend that he's interested in order to avoid just giving Trump a flat no. But what I expect Putin to do is to start laying out conditions. And these are going to be far-reaching. Putin has absolutist goals when it comes to Ukraine. He wants it to be neutral by treaty. He wants to keep all of the territory that he's already taken and maybe even get some more. The rest of the provinces that he claims to have annexed. He'll want to change the government in Ukraine. He doesn't like Zelensky. He wants Zelensky out of power and to put someone in that Russia would approve of. So he's going to have all kinds of demands. And I don't see this as leading to a ceasefire or leading to anything meaningful in the coming days.
I was expecting a slightly more optimistic approach. And I was going to ask you, okay, if we have this ceasefire, how do we move from that to a permanent peace?
Well, let's talk about that, because I think the likelihood of a ceasefire this year is still the case. The reasoning is different, though. It's because Putin is facing increasing difficulties with his economy. He has very high inflation, very high interest rates. The revenue he's getting from oil and gas is going to be going down as global prices go down and as the U.S. continues to apply sanctions, both on the financial system and the energy exports. So I think that Putin is going to be in a difficult situation and will need a ceasefire. But at this point, he's not ready. He's trying to push for more. To your question,
so he's buying time, you think?
Yeah, he's buying time. He wants to see if he can get for free everything that he wants. And if he can't, and then he starts facing difficulties, then he might be ready to talk about a ceasefire later. But at this stage, he still feels that he has the advantage, and he wants to see what Trump is willing to do to push the Ukrainians to give him things.
President Trump just said a few hours ago he's going to talk about land, about power plants, and about dividing certain assets. What do you understand he means?
Yeah, that's a great set of questions. We can only speculate. But when it comes to land, we know that Putin wants all of the provinces that he has claimed to have annexed. We know the Ukrainians do not want to give up those provinces. And it's also important that Ukraine be viable in the future, that this be a permanent and viable settlement. One idea, which at one point, and as you know, Trump's position seems to go all over the place, but at one point, Trump seemed to be indicating that Zaporizhia and Kherson provinces should go back to Ukraine. And this would give them the coastline on the Azov Sea. It would also secure the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is probably the most dangerous thing for Europe right now. This is booby-trapped by the Russians and could blow up and create a radioactive cloud that would affect Europe. So getting this out of Russian hands and disarming it, taking away these booby traps, that would be a critically important step. The other thing he might be talking about with energy production or energy facilities, Russia continues to attack every night Ukraine's power grid, its electricity generation, its distribution of electricity, its heating systems. And so Trump will want to urge the Russians to stop doing that. And in exchange, the Ukrainians would stop their attacks inside Russia as well, where they are hitting Russia's power production facilities, oil refineries, and so forth. So that would be another area to talk about. Assets, I'm guessing that what he's talking about there are mineral resources. You'll be familiar with the agreement that is planned to be reached between the US and Ukraine on development and sharing the benefits of Ukraine's natural resources, particularly strategic minerals. A lot of this is in territory that Russia occupies. And so there might also be some negotiation about the US gaining access to occupied territory for resource exploitation as well. It would not surprise me if that is on Trump's mind.
Do you see any possibility that might be fruitful, that there might be an agreement on that? Not tomorrow, but...
Yeah, I do, because I think Putin would like the idea of getting de facto US acceptance of Russian occupation. I don't think there will be formal recognition by anyone, Ukraine, Europe, United States, of occupied territory. But de facto, if the US is willing to work with occupation authorities, Putin would love that. So I think that he would actually be dangling that. It may even be what he discussed with Steve Witkoff in their private meeting. He may be dangling that as an economic incentive for Trump.
Now, I understand you say, this is what we understand also, that Putin is buying time. On the other hand, there seems to be an urgency from the American side for striking a deal. So I'm trying to understand why the urgency. Why is President Trump pushing so urgently for a deal on Ukraine?
Well, I think there are several reasons. First off, President Trump made a big deal about this in his campaign, saying that this would never have happened if he was president. Biden was weak. He let this get out of control. Now all of these people are being killed, thousands of people every week. So President Trump, I'm going to stop this. So it's important to him for his own sense of ego and credibility that he delivered on what he said. The second is the humanitarian aspect. I think he's sincere when he regrets the loss of life on both sides, young people who are fighting and dying. I think he's sincere about that. And then the third is that he would like this not to be on his agenda anymore. He wants to focus on the economy, on domestic issues in the US, as we see that he is doing a lot of, and on strengthening the United States so that we are better prepared to compete with China for the long haul. So settling this quickly is just simply in his interest to get it off the table. And settlement, and you were going here before, we can come back to this now. In President Trump's mind, a settlement rests largely on Europe taking care of security. He doesn't want the US to be burdened and bogged down by having to continue to defend Ukraine. He wants Europe to step up and take over that burden. And that also then means that he can reduce the level of US commitment to Ukraine, or at least repackage it as loans and as Ukraine paying its way through this mineral deal, for example, rather than something that is costing American taxpayers.
Okay. Now, if we're trying to take a look at the bigger picture, there was a time when there was a serious discussion, even in NATO, on whether Russia could be integrated into some sort of international security and economic order, then we moved on. This discussion was blown up. In the event that a peace deal is feasible in Ukraine, could that revive the question? Could Russia return to the table as a possible partner?
I'm very skeptical of that, at least as long as Vladimir Putin is president. He's been president for 25 years now, and with a minor exception when he let Medvedev take the title of president for a few years until he took it back. But I don't think Putin wants peace and security in Europe as a whole. He wants to divide and conquer. He wants to divide the European Union. He wants to divide NATO. He wants to flip governments, including in EU countries, such as we are seeing now in Romania, what he has done successfully in Slovakia and Hungary. He's trying in Bulgaria. So he has a very aggressive agenda against Europe and the United States. It's not a situation where there is some mutual compatibility, goodwill, shared interests. So I really don't see that as long as Putin is in power. I think it's important that you bring this up, though, because I was part of these efforts in the late 2000s when Lord Robertson was Secretary General of NATO. I was his Deputy Chief of Staff, and there were a lot of contacts with Russia then. I was at the National Security Council under President Bush, and we actually strengthened the NATO-Russia Council. And we had a summit with Putin in Italy at Pratica di Mare in 2002. So there was a lot of hope and a lot of effort on NATO's part for trying to build a common security space with Russia. And Russia just flat out rejected this, starting with the regrets about the collapse of the Soviet Union, which Putin began saying in 2004 and 2005. And then his Munich Security Conference speech in 2007, then his pulling out of the CFE treaty, Conventional Armed Forces in Europe treaty, as well as a lot of confidence building measure treaties like the Vienna document and Open Skies. So it was Putin beginning in the mid 2000s who started to tear up all of this European security architecture. And I don't think that we are getting back there as long as Putin is in power.
Let me turn to the relations across the Atlantic now. You just said that President Trump probably would like Europe to take over a big part of, at least a part of the burden of Ukraine, economically, military. But the way this is put forward is poisoning relations between Europe and the United States. And we try to wonder where, as you know, Europeans are starting to wonder whether the US is still there, is still our partner, in a way.
Yeah, I see that. And I think you're absolutely right. I just spent the past 2 weeks in Europe in a few different places. And what you describe is exactly the way people feel. And it is paradoxical in a way. He's squeezing Europe on tariffs. At the same time, he's asking Europe to do more on security. And you would think that there would be some coordination, some continuity here. And instead, it seems to be pulling in opposite directions. What I have to say, though, is that I have been impressed with how Europe is indeed stepping up on security. We've seen many more countries increase their levels of defense spending to over 2% of GDP, and some even higher than that. Poland is now at about 4.7%. Denmark is moving up to 3.2%. Italy has just announced, I shouldn't say announced, they are developing a plan to reach 2.2% by the end of this year. So, and the UK is increasing as well. So there is a lot happening where Europe is indeed stepping up. And we see Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron leading an effort to produce a coalition of the willing of European military forces that could help stabilize and protect Ukraine, deter future Russian attacks once there's a ceasefire. So despite everything, and the emotions you describe are real, I think that Europe is indeed stepping up the way that Americans have long wanted them to.
But when, for example, the future new Chancellor of Germany, Mr. Merz, says, I'll try to make Europe independent from the United States, how does it sound in Washington?
Well, it's not that problematic a phrase in Washington. Most people here, and this goes through the Democrats and President Obama, where I was still ambassador when Obama was elected. They have been urging Europe to do more for decades. It was the Wales summit under President Obama in 2014 where this 2% of GDP target was codified. And yet, by 2017, 3 years later, when President Trump took office, only 3 countries were doing it. So it was frustrating to people in Washington. And to hear that Europe will indeed stand more on its own, be more independent, spend more on defense, provide for security, this is actually a welcome sign. It's a shame that it is done out of anger and frustration with the United States rather than Europe's own desire to step up. But the result may be the same. And, President Trump will be president for this term, another 3.5 years. And then the U.S. will move on as well. And the relations between our people, between the United States and Europe, are very, very deep. And they go through families. They go back centuries. It is more than just the current political environment.
That's what. Let me insist on that. What we're seeing in those first 50 days of the second Trump term, is it just a passage? Is it something? It has something to do with the personality, the attitude, the way of talking of President Trump and people around him, or does it reflect a more long-term change in U.S. priorities? Is Europe was a top priority for the U.S. some decades ago. It seems it is not anymore. So, in what extent does it reflect a permanent shift in the American priorities?
Yeah, well, it's both. It's both. And I'll point out the similarities between President Obama's policies and President Trump's policies, where it was Obama who wanted to pivot to Asia, who wanted to reduce the U.S. presence in Europe. He was skeptical about NATO enlargement because it was just committing the U.S. more. He was pushing for Europe to cover more of its share of defense. So, and he was withdrawing the U.S. from other places around the world. He announced in 2009 that he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. He didn't in the end, but he wanted to. He did get out of Iraq and Syria and ended up having to go back because of the outbreak of violence in ISIS and terrorist attacks and so forth. So there's a lot of similarity between the policies of the two of them. So there is kind of a long-term trend here. But this is amplified under President Trump because of the personality, the style, the aggressiveness, and his also sense of doing everything all at once. This is something that we've not seen before in the U.S. A president who comes in with, both guns blazing and trying to go after everything. And I have to say, living in Washington, most of this is about domestic politics. Most of it is about shutting down parts of the federal government, firing federal employees, cutting contracts, eliminating parts of a progressive political agenda, diversity, equity, and inclusion, wokeism, transgender issues, women's sports, you name it. He's going after the border, immigration, deportations. All of this is happening at lightning speed. And it is very, very disruptive. And what we see in his approach to Europe and Ukraine and Russia right now is consistent with what he's doing overall, maybe even a little less dramatic than what's happening at home.
I see. Now, please try to see this from the Athens viewpoint, to see this picture. During the last many years, the US-Greek partnership on defense, economy, etc., was strengthening. It happened during the Obama years. It moved on. It kept on during the first Trump term. It continued with President Biden. Do you see any sign that we might see a change there in the way Washington sees that?
Yeah, I don't think so, to be honest. A lot of the rhetoric is about who's spending how much money. And President Trump is not anti-NATO. And it's important to see that what he's doing is trying to rebalance NATO so Europe pulls more of the load. But he's not trying to pull the US out of NATO or weaken NATO. In fact, if Europe does spend more on defense and take on greater responsibilities, it will strengthen NATO. I also think that when you look at ending the war in Ukraine and rebalancing the alliance as we're talking about, Trump will look for opportunities to see what the US can reduce or reprogram, reshift the role. And I don't think there's going to be any diminution of support for bilateral or even NATO military cooperation. But you might see, again, more of a re-emphasis on expeditionary forces, an over-the-horizon presence that can apply pressure in the Middle East or elsewhere, hoping that Europe takes the lead in Europe and that the US will have relationships that will facilitate its global role. That would probably be where things would go. And then you would have a discussion within the Pentagon about what's the right size of the US force for this type of role. It may not be 100,000 troops on the ground in Europe, as we now have. If you remember, under President Obama, we were down around 30,000. And I suspect that if there is peace in Europe, and that's a big if, but if Trump succeeds at ceasefire in Europe, stabilization of Ukraine, deterring future Russian attacks, then I think you're going to have a fresh look at what's the right American force posture. Probably not as low as 30,000, probably a different mix of types of forces, and probably not as high as 100,000. That's kind of where I would think this would naturally go in a few years' time, assuming we have peace.
Well, still, from the Athens viewpoint, as you know very well, Greece is looking at the world through the Turkish lens.
Yeah.
We consider that we are facing a threat from Turkey, so all our foreign relations and our priorities are moved through this priority.
Yeah.
We've known for years that the American stance was to strike a balance in the Greek-Turkish relation, not distort its dynamics, strike a balance. And in the first Trump term, after all, this was how things went. We wonder if this might change.
Yeah, I don't think it'll change with respect to Greece and Turkey. I think that the balance that you described there is likely to be maintained under a second Trump term as well. And of course, that depends upon Turkey and Greece also helping to maintain that balance, which they have been doing in the past several years. I don't think that there has been the realization of some of the fears and worries that are there, although it could always happen. I do believe that there is a reasonable likelihood of an improving U.S.-Turkish relationship under President Trump in this term. The reason I say that is that I think Erdogan has changed a few policies or done a few things that are going to make it easier for the U.S. and Turkey to work together. I'm particularly thinking about putting in place the government in Syria that Turkey has helped to do, and simultaneously reaching a truce with the PKK so that they are no longer going to be fighting with the Syrian Kurds, whom the U.S. has been working with in Syria. So we might find a bit of a better accommodation between the US and Turkey with respect to Syria. Second, in the event of a ceasefire in Ukraine and the movement towards a peace settlement, Turkey will probably want to be a part of that, and I think the US would welcome Turkey being a part of that. It was notable that when Keir Starmer first called people together in London for this discussion of a coalition of the willing, Turkey indeed sent a representative, not Erdogan himself, but a senior representative. So they're keeping their eyes open on this. And I think that Turkey has always had a bit of a two sides of the coin approach to Russia. Some cooperation, but also a chokehold on the Bosphorus, and not wanting to see Russian influence extend into areas where Turkey has influence. And so I think that they are seeing this possibility of a ceasefire and containment of Russia positively right now, because it also helps Turkey in its position in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that we might see at some point a turn in the way Turkey addresses its relations with Israel too? Because I guess Israel too is a priority for the Trump administration.
It is. And at the moment, no. But things can always change. What you see is Turkey is now having a bit of a rivalry with both Saudi Arabia and Iran. Mm-hmm. Saudi Arabia is likely to increasingly align with Israel and against Iran. And this may actually be something where Turkey sees that its interests might be more to align with Israel and Saudi Arabia as well. It can't do that easily right now with Gaza in the situation that it is. The Turks support the Muslim Brotherhood, they support Hamas, they are very anti-Israel when it comes to Israel's bombings and the treatment of Hamas in Gaza. So there is this stoppage. But if you can imagine a situation where Saudi Arabia and Israel are more closely in alignment, there is some kind of settling down of the conflict, and Saudi Arabia is playing a role in Gaza to provide humanitarian support, possibly helping to avoid direct confrontations in Gaza. This might be something where Turkey feels that, okay, it can start to engage now too.
Okay. And lastly, let me drag you into Greek diplomatic gossip. For the last 25 years, Greek-Turkish relations have their ups and downs, but there has never been really a crisis. Last time we had a crisis in the Greek-Turkish field was 1996. At that point, somebody from Washington, when things were starting to turn very dangerously, somebody from Washington picked up the phone, talked with the Turkish President Demirel, the late President Demirel at the time, and he said blatantly, hold your guns. The question is, if something like that happens again, would anybody from Washington care to pick up the phone?
Yes, is the short answer. There would be a very strong sentiment, whether it's President Trump or Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, or Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor. All of them would want to avoid an outbreak of war in Europe, especially between allies. It's something that they would very strongly be against. Whether we would have the same level of influence in Europe and with Turkey that we did in 1996, that's a different question. And it really would depend on how President Trump were to view this and weigh in on this. And as you know, he's very unpredictable. But I think just what we were talking about, the opportunity of rebuilding some of a U.S.-Turkish relationship would probably be positive. In the event that we did face a situation like that, we'd have more influence again.
Okay. Ambassador Volker, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
We are very grateful for your intervention. Thank you very much.
And I wish I was there in person with you in Greece. I've stayed at the Grande Bretagne. I know it well, and I hope to be there again soon.
That would be great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Λοιπόν, σας υπενθυμίζω ότι ο πρέσβης Volker έχει μια μακρά θητεία στην Αμερικανική Διπλωματική Υπηρεσία και ότι επίσης συνεργάστηκε με τον πρόεδρο Τραμπ στην προηγούμενη θητεία του. Ήταν εκείνος που επελέγει ως ειδικός απεσταλμένος στην Ουκρανία. Λάβετε το υπόψη σας για να εκτιμήσετε αυτά που μόλις ακούσατε. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.